Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues, dear guests. Today it is the 6th of September 2021, 3 p.m. according to Moscow time. Allow me to consider open the meeting of the Dissertation Council for the defense of Zabelina Ekaterina for the degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Scientific Speciality 190005, Social Psychology, topic Psychological Time and Economic Mind, Social and Psychological Analysis. Our Dissertation Council was approved by the order of Alexander Gnetov, St. Petersburg University Scientific Secretary from the 13th of May 2021, number 4824/1, and me, Gurieva Svetlana Zakhotovna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Social Psychology, St. Petersburg University, was appointed the chairperson of this Dissertation Council. By the same order, all the members of the Dissertation Council were approved, and allow me to introduce them. Почебут Людмила Георгиевна, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Social Psychology, St. Petersburg University. Maximenko Alexander Alexandrovich, Doctor of Sociological Sciences, Candidate of Psychological Sciences, Associate Professor, Expert of Project Academic Laboratory, Anti-Corruptional Policy of National Research University, High School of Economics. Nestik Timofey Alexandrovich, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor of the Russian Academy of Sciences, Head of the Laboratory of Social and Economic Psychology, Institute of Psychology of the Russian Academy of Sciences. In the remote interactive mode, we have got our colleagues. Christy Koev, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor of the University of Tartu. Can you see and hear us? Yes, the answer is positive. Gonsirovska Agata Dorota, University of Social Sciences and Humanities, Poland. Can you see and hear us? The answer is positive. Our candidate is also here with us, Zabelina Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna, and scientific advisor is also here with us, Deneka Olga Sergeyevna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Political Psychology, St. Petersburg University. Dear colleagues, audio and video recording is also providing, as well as direct broadcast at the website of St. Petersburg University. Also, simultaneous interpretation from Russian into English and from English into Russian is also provided. And at this time, an email address is posted on the live broadcast of the meeting of the Dissertation Council, where during the meeting all listeners can express their opinions and send questions to the applicant online concerning her dissertation and the current scientific discussion of her speech. These questions will be forwarded to me by technical services, and I will voice them during the discussion. Questions must be related to the applicant's presentation and the content of her dissertation, and the name, position, and place of work of the author of the question must be indicated. Questions that are not related to the scientific discussion, to the discussion of the dissertation, to the text and assessment of the dissertation itself will not be voiced. In accordance with the procedure for awarding the academic degree of Candidate of Sciences, academic degree of Doctor of Sciences at St. Petersburg University, approved by local regulations. Hereinafter the procedure A meeting of the Dissertation Council is considered eligible if at least 2/3 of the approved membership of the Council takes part in its work, but not less than 4 people. Our Dissertation Council consists of 6 people. 6 members are present, including 4 members are here and 2 members are in the remote interactive mode. All members of the Dissertation Council, candidate audio and video contact is provided. Thus, there is a quorum. The procedure of today's meeting of the Dissertation Council, with a total duration of approximately 2 hours, is the following. Allow me to present this procedure to you. A brief report of the chairperson on the documents submitted by the applicant for a scientific degree and their compliance with the established requirements. Answers to possible questions, about 5 minutes. A short presentation by the applicant for a scientific degree reflecting the main points of your research, approximately 20 minutes. Questions to the applicant, strictly according to your report, no more than 2 minutes per question. Answers of the applicant, no more than 10 minutes for all questions. Speeches of all members of the Dissertation Council in turn, with their assessment of the dissertation research, with a summary of their positions, with questions and suggestions for the dissertation, about 10 minutes per speaker. The speech of the chairperson with the review, answers of the applicant for a scientific degree to questions and comments of the members of the Dissertation Council, no more than 20 minutes. Open discussion, speeches at the request of those present at the defense of the dissertations with a summary of their positions and or with specific questions and proposals for the dissertation strictly on the topic of the research. At the same time, all interested people are requested to register in the registration form and completely introduce themselves before the performance. Presentations by the chairperson of questions addressed to the applicant, which came in order to discuss her speech, and scientific discussion of the broadcast of the meeting of the Dissertation Council on the St. Petersburg University website. Answers of the applicant, a speech of the scientific advisor of the applicant, no more than 3 minutes. Discussion of the results of the defense by the members of the Dissertation Council before the open vote, during which the sound of the broadcast is muted, about 5 minutes. Open roll call, counting of votes by the chairperson of the Dissertation Council with the entry of the results into the minutes of the meeting, making a decision on awarding or not awarding an academic degree, concluding remarks of the applicant, no more than 2 minutes. Dear colleagues, are there any questions or objections to this regulation? Thank you. If there are no objections, I will proceed to the implementation of the rules of the meeting, but before, please turn off the sound of mobile phones. Thank you for understanding. Let us start the procedure. The short report of the chairperson. The dissertation of Zabelina Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna for the degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences, specialization 190005, Social Psychology, on the topic Psychological Time and Economic Mind, Social and Psychological Analysis, was accepted for the defense by the order of Scientific Secretary from the 13th of April 2021, the number of the order 3121/1. Zabelina Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna wrote her dissertational research on the basis of Chelyabinsk State University. Her scientific secretary, Daneka Olga Sergeyevna, Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Professor of the Department of Political Psychology, St. Petersburg University. The number of publications of the candidate, 24 works in the there are 15 publications in the journals of the Ministry of Education of the Russian Federation, 9 publications in Web of Science and Scopus. The candidates submitted all the documents to the Scientific Secretary of St. Petersburg University. All the documents comply with the requirements and are stored in the attestation file, and the copies are stored by the worker of the Department of Dissertation Councils, and she is here with us in this call. Dear board members, do you have general questions to the candidate? And is there a necessity to consider all the list of the documents submitted by the candidate for the defense? Thank you. No questions. And let us start our procedure. Dear candidate, you have got 20 minutes. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. Dear board members, allow me to introduce the main provisions of my dissertations. A few words about the relevance of the topic. Time as an irreplaceable life resource has always had a high value in people's lives, but today, under the conditions of accelerating flow of information, time in subjective perception is compressed and denser. This phenomenon, which has received the definition of systematic illusion of temporary pressure, time pressure illusion, can cause negative symptoms and as a result lead to a decrease in subjective well-being, including the economic sphere. Despite the urgency of the problem, there is a certain lack of theoretical and empirical research in this area. In particular, studies of psychological time in various types of economic behavior, consumer, entrepreneurial, financial, and especially in the Russian sample, are often left without scientific attention. The scientific problem of this work forms the vector of research of this structure, characteristics, determinants, and effects of psychological time in economic psychology. The aim of the research is to develop the concept of psychological time in economic psychology. The object of the research is representatives of different social groups distinguished by age, educational level, ethnic and professional affiliation, and economic status. The subject of the dissertation research is the essence, determinants, and effects of the psychological time of an individual in the economic sphere of life. The main hypothesis of the research is formulated as follows. Psychological time is a factor that influences the economic consciousness or mind of an individual and plays an important role in the formation of subjective economic well-being. The next slide lists the scientific approaches that formed the theoretical and methodological basis of the study, including domestic and foreign concepts of the psychology of time, the economic and psychological approach, and others. The theoretical and methodological basis of the study was the provisions of systematic approach in psychology. To test hypotheses, quantitative and qualitative research methods were used. You can see them on the slide. To solve the tasks, the following research methods were used: survey, psychological testing, structured interviews. The processing used the following statistical procedures: descriptive statistics, parametric and non-parametric methods for assessing the statistical significance of differences, cluster, regression, correlation, exploratory and confirmatory factor types of analysis, modeling using structural equations. And provision number 2, the structure of psychological time in the economic sphere includes 4 components: cognitive, the horizon of economic planning, time focus, orientation to the past, present, or future, when making economic decisions, emotional reactions to events of economic reality in the past, present, future, sense of time in economic behavior, value motivational, value of time as an economic resource, economic locus of control, and behavioral manifestation of polychrony in economic behavior. The components of this structure are closely related and intertwined. The most typical empirically identified components of the structure of psychological time in the Russian sample are negative emotional, negative cognitive, positive cognitive. On the slide, you can see the structure of psychological time in a sample of residents of the southwestern part of the Russian Federation. This structure was confirmed in the confirmatory factor analysis. An empirical test of the structure shows that it takes on a qualitative identity depending on social, professional, and cultural ethnicity, as well as in difficult economic situation. The following studies show, as an example, the structure of psychological time on different samples, where you can see the difference in the number of factors and in their content. Provision number 3. Demographic factors, gender and age, to a certain extent specify the components of psychological time in economic mind. Psychological time plays a different role in economic mind at different stages of a person's life, which is most likely associated with the dynamics of economic activity. The strongest and most saturated structure of interconnections between psychological time and economic mind is observed at the age of 20 to 40, probably because this period is characterized by the greatest activity of economic behavior, the implementation of most economic roles. With the transition to mature, 40, 60 years old, and elderly, more than 60 years old, the links between psychological time and economic consciousness are gradually destroyed, which can be explained by the curtailment of some of economic functions and roles. The psychological time of an individual, using the time focus as an example, is, along with other phenomena, the marker that indicates labor activity and the level of subjective economic well-being upon retirement. The results of the correlation analysis demonstrate that in the group of non-working pensioners, fewer relationships with the temporal focus were found, and they are opposite in their content to the relationships identified in the group of working pensioners. People who have made a decision to finish work are less likely to focus on present events in their economic consciousness and more focused on the past. Provision number 4, the cultural characteristics of countries and small ethnic groups determine the specifics of the relationships between psychological time and economic consciousness. This was demonstrated by the example of countries that are polar in many respects: Russia, Japan, Ecuador, as well as within the Russian multicultural society. Cultural values associated with psychological time have an indirect impact on technology-oriented consumer behavior. In this slide, the structural model shows that high levels of uncertainty avoidance are positively associated with technology distrust, which in turn is negatively associated with technology-based consumer behavior, preference for online shopping in different countries. Provision number 5, belonging to a social and professional group and to the type of organization, is accompanied by a specific relationship between psychological time and economic consciousness. The components of psychological time make a specific contribution to the formation of attitudes towards economic reality, depending on belonging to the profession and to the type of organization. If in commercial companies there is a large role in determining economic attitudes, the time perspective of the future plays then in the state a more important factor is the fatalistic perception of current events in conjunction with general negative perception of lifetime. This is confirmed by the results of the regression analysis presented on the slide. The difference in temporal predictors of economic attitudes is clearly manifested in the example of a positive attitude towards savings, which gives confidence in the future and a sense of well-being. In the group of information technology specialists, this attitude is reduced due to negative expectations from the future. In the group of teachers, it is strengthened by the aspiration for the future and reliance on positive experience. In a group of workers, it is supported by immersion in an active, controlled present. The slide provides an example from a study illustrating the differences in time perspective between entrepreneurs and employees. Provision number 6. In difficult economic situations, the psychological time of a person performs a compensatory function and a resource function, a retention towards a positive past, continuous identity. The compensatory function is demonstrated by the example of people who emigrated to another country. The slide shows the results of a comparative analysis of the severity of the time perspective in migrants and non-migrants. In migrants, we see a significantly lower indicator of the hedonic present and higher indicator of orientation towards the future. The attitude today is bad, tomorrow is good. It can also be seen that the indicators of the positive past are higher among migrants at the level of tendencies, which is an illustration of the resource function of psychological time. We saw earlier that focusing on the past is an important element of subjective economic well-being when retiring. The same picture combined with coping strategies can be observed in a group of unemployed citizens. Provision number 7. The verified model of the relationship between psychological time and economic consciousness allows us to consider subjective time as a factor that directly and indirectly, through economic attitudes, affects subjective economic well-being. Personal values make a significant contribution to formation of a balanced time perspective, and through it to the formation of positive attitudes in the economic sphere and subjective economic well-being. It was found that life values make a greater contribution to the formation of the components of psychological time, and through them to the formation of economic mind in comparison with the facts of the relationship between psychological time and economic mind discovered in the framework of the dissertation. Research made it possible to formulate the concept of psychological time and economic psychology in the economic space of an individual, group, society. Specific features of psychological time are formed depending on gender, age, belonging to a social, professional, and cultural ethnic group, as well as taking into account a specific economic situation. In the economic sphere of life, the psychological time of an individual should be considered as a factor influencing economic consciousness, changing the severity of its components and structure as a whole, and playing an important role in the formation of a subjective economic well-being. Life values are most closely related to the components of psychological time, and in this structure they can act as the value time predictors of economic consciousness. The theoretical and empirical material presented in the dissertation research allows us to talk about a new dissertation direction in economic psychology. Thank you very much. I have finished. Please, your questions to the candidate. Thank you very much. A very interesting report and very interesting research. I would like to ask you, what is the role, in your opinion, social optimism play? And is it possible to consider the phenomenon of optimism according to the results of your research? Thank you very much for the question. Indeed, I don't have the definition of social optimism in my work, but there are all prerequisites to that. When we studied economic attitudes about different groups, social and professional groups, we saw that part of respondents found more optimism in economic sphere. Social optimism, for example, they consider that the level of their well-being will increase in the future, and it happens in different groups regardless professional relevance. And as we see from final pastoral model, social optimism is closely connected with component of psychological time. We can say that positive attitude to the present, insights into the future, plans for the futures, and basing on positive past. The experience I have, it explains social and economic optimism, and it is a considerable role in this psychological sense. You speak about balanced time perspective. Yes, right you are. And this phenomenon, balanced time perspective, was introduced by Boniva and other scholars without correlation with economic sphere. But in this research, we managed to demonstrate balanced time perspective, and they define economic well-being. Thank you. Any other questions? Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna, thank you for your interesting report. At the beginning, you said that type of economic situation influences many things. Pensioners, were there any classifications, typologies in your paper of types of economic situations? Thank you for your question. Alexander Alexandrovich, I agree that there can be more factors. We took the most typical situations, the situations connected with pandemic. It gave a vast material for my research. We took the situation of pensioners, of retirement. It is connected with the decreasing of income, the moving to other country, migrants, and the situation connected with COVID. How people understand economic situation connected with this crisis. But there can be more factors, loss of work, unemployment, individual economic crisis, personal economic crisis, and how this difficult situation is survived by a person. Thank you. What are the difference in time attitude did you find between men and women? Thank you. If we take time attitudes in men and women, our results are to explain the results of previous researchers, Sirtsov, Zimbardo, and others. There were no unexpected situations. Men are oriented into the future, and women are oriented towards the present. They understand positively the events of the past. Dear Agata, do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I'm wondering if you could say whether the situation of pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis, could affect people's time attitudes or time perspective. What would be your guess? Whether the uncertainty that we experience now could affect one's time perspective?
Thank you very much for your question. I can say that our research shows that the situation with pandemic indeed influences the time attitude. It is experienced otherwise, and the mechanisms of changing time attitudes in the situation of economic crisis, they are similar to other type of difficult situations which happen. And if we speak generally, there is a breakdown in time perspective. The attention is focused on the present, and the time perspective of the future is shortened. It can be connected with the situation of uncertainty, which appears in such difficult crisis situations.
Yeah, that would be my guess. Thank you very much.
Спасибо. Есть ли еще вопросы, пожалуйста?
Are there any other questions? Agata, do you have any questions? No questions, thank you. Dear colleagues, are there any other questions? No questions, thank you very much. Let us turn to the speeches of dissertational research with the questions and suggestions to the candidate, negative assessments if there are. So our candidates can answer after each speech, or I offer you to answer after each speech. Do you agree with such a procedure? There are no external reviews. Let us turn to the speeches of our board members. Dear colleagues, all the reports were published at the website of St. Petersburg University. I ask you to focus on the main moments and your remarks. Do you have any objections? Thank you very much for your understanding. And now let us turn to the speeches. Lyudmila Georgievna, the floor is yours. Dear Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna, dear board members, and all those who are present today. The relevance of this dissertation research is argumented and proved. Under psychological time, she understands the set of understandings, perceptions, imaginations, and attitudes of a personality to physical time of life. The lack of theoretical and empirical researches in this direction, the relevance, actuality, is defined by the necessity of the concept of psychological time in the reflections of economic reality of a person in informational society. The aim of the research is in the creation of the concept of psychological time. Economic psychology, logical, empirical hypotheses were developed. Tasks of theoretical and empirical research respond and meet the direction of the dissertation work, the scientific novelty of the research. For the first time in domestic economic psychology, the concept of psychological time was developed. The theoretical model of the interaction of psychological time and economic mind was verified. The determination of economic mind was developed. Theoretical significance of the work was in formulating of the definition of psychological time in economic psychology. Its structural components and functions were defined. New psychological terms were offered. Practical significance of the results. The author highlights the concept of economic time, psychological time in economic life can be used for the solution of the questions in social and economic policy in the sphere of the development of entrepreneurship, employment, international migration. The provisions for the defense, all the aspects of the theoretical and empirical research were explained. The approbation of the results were represented in 40 scientific publications. I would like to highlight the advantages and disadvantages of the research. Advantages, the detailed analysis of the literature on the problems of psychological mind and time. The program of the research was clearly formulated. The aims, hypotheses were defined, and adequate methods of the research were used. Empirical research of demographic factors and cross-cultural aspects of psychological time as economic actor. Number 4. The influence of economic situation and peculiarities of professional activity on psychological time of personality. Number 5. The model of interaction of psychological time and economic mind was developed. Number 6. The specific psychological recommendations were developed. As for the drawbacks of the dissertation, number 1, inaccurate scientific definition of the concept of time. For example, dissertational paper is started with the statement time is a category of social mind. We think that time, it is the phenomenon of objective reality, the category of social well-being. And time is a psychological phenomenon. It is one of the significant components of psychological mind, social mind. Number 2, the main theoretical hypothesis of the research is formulated as follows. Psychological time is a factor influencing economic mind of a personality and playing the main role in forming of subjective economic well-being. This phenomenon is explained by demographic variables, age, gender, the level of income, professional activity, culture, and type of economic situation. Let me allow not to agree with this formulation. Psychological time attitude of personality and so on can't be the factor of economic mind. We think it is the main components of the mind, including economic one. Number 3, the practical significance of the research is not detailed. The aspects of practical significance are listed, and they are presented as a declaration about intention. The dissertation of Zabelina, Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna on the topic psychological time and economic mind, social and psychological analysis, conforms with the requirements, with main requirements stated by the order from the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1, procedure on awarding degrees at St. Petersburg University, and the candidate Zabelina Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna deserves the degree of Doctor of Psychological Sciences, specialization 190005, Social Psychology. Point 9 and 11 were not violated by the candidates. Thank you for your attention. Lyudmila Georgievna, thank you very much for your review. Dear candidate, please answer the questions. Thank you very much, Lyudmila Georgievna, for a positive assessment of the work and important comments. Before I agree with the respected experts that the work does not define time as an objective reality. First remark, we study the phenomenon of psychological time, but by which we mean the totality of psychomediated perception, representation, experience, and attitude of the individual to the psychological time of life, conditioned by the social, historical, global conditions of human life and determining the behavior. The second remark seems to be very valuable. We agree that psychological time is included in the realm of consciousness. Speaking about time as a factor, we mean that it can be considered as an internal psychological factor. According to Lomov, the term factor in this case emphasizes its influence on economic consciousness and subjective economic well-being. We agree also with the third remark. The recommendation provides enlarged directions for correcting certain components of economic mind and behavior by changing the perception of time by a person. I am satisfied with your answer, and please be careful with formulations in the future. I will take it into account. And now the floor is given to Maximenko Alexander Alexandrovich. Thank you very much. I would like to note that understanding of such universal categories and time chronotopies allows the author of the dissertation conduct very significant research and avoid traps and stereotypes. Let us remember Sartre, who spoke that every person has the whole of the size of the God, and the problem is correlated with this Sartre's problem. Secondly, the author manages to overcome the approach of Augustin Avreli, who could not understand what time means. It is evading phenomenon. Secondly, the author solves fundamental problem of traditional interpretation of time, of understanding of well-being on the whole in the economic life, which allows to discuss the connection of psychological time, economic mind in the direction of humanism as rich postmodern tradition. I would like to focus on the advantages of the work. The work is logical. There is the connection between paragraphs 452 foreign sources and hard work of our candidate with monographies, periodic literature, and the results of empirical research conducted by our candidate. Are fundamental. And our candidates developed the structure of psychological time in economic sphere, including cognitive analysis, behavioral components. The law of relevance was carefully studied. The author proves the conditions of equality within the time, and our candidate explains the dependence between the cultural values and psychological time. They influence consumer behavior, and these tendencies of time effects allow the author to define the spirit of the time and become the pioneer in the understanding of flexibility phenomenon. We used the flexibility term to understand the phenomenon of postmodern times. And Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna managed to use this hypothesis in her work. The statements about the possibility of time became the condensating factor in difficult life and economic situation. The ability to overcome life difficulties, strive into the future, and the conclusion of the candidate about state officials and entrepreneurs, the understanding of psychological time and economic mind, two professional main groups, interpret differently modality and timing. In this respect, social and synchronization of psychological time of these two professional groups, not for each other but also for the country, will become one of the main catalyzers of increasing factors. Along with that, there are the researches of high practical value, and there are for my remarks. Economic minds of women are strictly within the time limit. And as for life expectancy of men is lower in comparison to women life expectancy. And as for attitude of worker, page 104, latent factor, defining this interaction, number 3. The procedure of cluster formation, page 141. There is no explanation of this procedure. Please comment how did you cluster this thing and that women are more satisfied with current moment, page 108. And finally, the reference to the work of Gansen's correlation of Arthur's model and scientific pentabasis, energy, information, space, different variations of which showed Professor Alexander Yurev. Unfortunately, he deceased several years ago. But these remarks don't contradict my overall positive assessment of the work, and the dissertation shows the results of completed research. The topic is actual, devoted to the main scientific problem. Thus, to conclude, the dissertation, Psychological Time and Economic Mind, Social and Psychological Analysis of Zabelina Ekaterina for the degree of Doctor of Psychological Sciences, specialization 19005, Social Psychology, meets the requirements, and our candidate deserves the degree of Doctor of Psychological Sciences, specialization 19005, Social Psychology. Thank you. Alexander Alexandrovich, thank you very much. Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna, please answer the questions and remarks. We are grateful to Alexander Alexandrovich for careful reading of the work and high appreciation. The conclusion that the economic consciousness of women is characterized by a more complex time determination was made when interpreting the results of regression analysis, which showed that more components of psychological time are involved in the formation of women's economic attitudes than in men. This conclusion is expressed as an assumption and needs. In response to this second remark, it should be said that these relationships were identified in the course of correlation analysis, where the value of the coefficient and statistical significance indicates their reliability. Confirmation of this relationship was found in the course of modeling with structural equations, which also indicates the validity of this conclusion. The third remark, when forming the clusters, the K-means method was used, and the mean values of scales future, hedonic, present, and positive past were selected as indicators in a balanced time perspective. The conclusion that women are more willing to get involved in getting pleasure from the present moment than men was made according to the results of a comparative analysis, which showed significant difference in the scale hedonic present and a positive attitude to the present. In women, these indicators are significantly higher than in men. We fully agree with the fifth remark of the distinguished experts. The results obtained from the model of a general scientific pentabasis of Hansen and testify to the relationship of time, space, energy, and information. We based on the systematic approach of Gansen and Lomov. Distinguished Alexander Alexandrovich, are you satisfied with the answers? Thank you very much. And now the floor is given to distinguished Professor Nestik. Distinguished Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna, distinguished board members, speaking about the work of our candidate, I want to say that we today survive high level of uncertainty. Uncertainty connected with technological and economic changes. And the higher uncertainty is, the more significant time aspects of economic mind and behavior are. In this respect, our attitude to the past, present, and future defines the extent of the success connected with challenges. It influences the success of our professional activity and livability of personality and the society on the whole. In this respect, there is a task to specify how psychological time influences the economic mind and people's behavior. And without doubt, the work of Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna contributes a lot into the solution of this problem. I'm not going to read out the whole review. I want to say that, indeed, the work presents the independent direction, scientific direction, and the subject is the reflection of time and economic mind. Of high interest is the conclusion that economic activity, the main role is played by balanced time perspective, and the fact that orientation to negative past, fatalistic, hedonistic present enhance constructive settings in economic sphere. Of high interest is the connection of long-term orientation and avoidance of uncertainty from technological-oriented consumer behavior. And of course, those methods which were developed and adapted by our candidate, they will be demanded by scientific community. There has been said a lot about strong points of the work. Please let me introduce my remarks. I have got 5 remarks. They are in my written research. I would like to focus on my first 3 remarks. Firstly, there are 2 variants of the structure of psychological time in the paper, and they are not always correlated to each other. In the first variant, you speak about cognitive, emotional, and behavioral components. In the second variant, you speak about typical components of structure of psychological time: negative emotional, negative cognitive, positive cognitive. I think that in this case it would be better to speak about not about components, but about types of psychological time in economic activity. Apart from that, it seems to me the name of these factors don't reflect. For example, a negative factor could be named pessimistic. Negative cognitive factor could be called fatalistic. Positive cognitive factor could be called harmonic. Secondly, there is a tradition of study, time perspective, time orientation, which some scholars consider a characteristic of perspective. And in this respect, the understanding of time focus as new phenomenon is doubtful. It's not clear what is the difference between time orientation as one of the characteristics of our attitude towards time and the ability to time dissertation. Dissertation depending on the requirements of the task and modules of time, past, present, and future. To conclude, in my opinion, it is subjective, my point of view. In this case, there is a mixture of methodological novelty when we speak about adapted methodology and phenomenological novelty. And thirdly, in my opinion, when we interpret the data acquired, it's not clear from the work. The different levels of psychological analysis are not clearly differentiated. First of all, individual and group psychological mechanisms of functioning of psychological time and economic activity. These are my main remarks. They are of discursive character and they don't decrease overall positive impression from the study. Dissertation of Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna Zabelina conforms with the main requirements stated by the order on awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University. The candidate deserves the degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences, specialization 190005, Social Psychology, and points 9 and 11 of the procedure were not violated by the candidate. Thank you very much for the review. Please, the answers. We are grateful to you for the deep study of the work and valuable ideas for further research. The first remark, at this stage of theoretical analysis based on existing models, 4 components were identified in the structure of psychological time in economic consciousness. In accordance with them, research methods were selected. However, at this stage of empirical analysis, it was found that the selected components do not exist in isolation, but are closely intertwined and interact with each other. In this sense, the theoretical and empirical structures do not really copy each other completely. The empirical structure is more complex than the theoretical one, as real life is also more complex than its theoretical model. As for the possibility of identifying the types of psychological time and their names, this is the great idea and reason for a joint article, if you don't mind. The second remark. The concept of time focus was introduced by Anna Shipp and colleagues. It refers to the amount of attention people give to thinking about the past, present and future, and which affects how people build in ideas about past experiences, current situations, future expectations into their attitudes and behavior. The author agreed to adapt the method for studying the temporal focus on the Russian sample. This construct is close to the phenomenon of temporal orientation in the sense that it means a person's concentration on the events of the past, present and future. However, temporal orientation also concludes affective and behavioral components, while the temporal focus reflects only the cognitive side. We agree with the third remark. The work pays more attention to the personal level of analysis, individual psychological mechanisms such as economic activity, life values and others. In further research, it is important to study more deeply the social and psychological mechanism of psychological time in economic behavior, for example, group identity, group nostalgia, cultural values, which will require a different research design. Ekaterina Vyacheslavovna, thank you very much. I'm fully satisfied with your answers. Christy Koev, please voice your speech.
Добрый день. Dear dissertant, dear board members, colleagues, guests, thank you for the possibility to review the PhD thesis of Ekaterina Zabelina. At first, I should like to give some main general comments and after that, some specific main comments. Dissertation provides an overwhelming insight into economic psychology of time, focusing mainly on the conceptual and organizational associations between 2 keywords, the psychological time, personality, and economic mind of personality and a group. This thesis addresses the highly relevant and vital areas of social psychology research integrating the current and historical research with rising new areas in our nowadays economic psychology of time. Theoretical and methodological basis of the research are works of leading authors, as well as references from valid and relevant scientific literature based on more than 800 sources for the discussed field. Well over half of the references are in Russian and in English, mostly current sources. The literature used as a source of the information is impressive and very large. The key conclusions of the dissertation research are justified by overwhelming empirical data and stem from rich research body. The dissertation has a clear contribution and interesting results, and it addresses a renewed topic. New major criticism, I should like to go to the specific comments. Introduction of the main text is proper, including the general theoretical and methodological foundations of the study, highlighting the importance of the issue and the relevance of the research topic. This part is well written and provides a good background for understanding the rest of the thesis. The general aim of the study and object and subject of the dissertation research have explained and as well as general theoretical hypotheses and specific 7 empirical hypotheses of the research are presented. Whether the general theoretical hypothesis is postulated as one-side effect between the psychological time and economic mind of the individual with mediated factors. At the other side, the theoretical model of the dissertation in the chapter 4 postulates causal relationships between psychological time, economic mind, with mediating the effects of external and internal factors. It raises a question I should like to answer candidate during the academical discussion. Question is, how the developed theoretical model of the causal relationships between the psychological time and economic mind has received empirical confirmation. Section 1 in the research introduces and discusses previous theoretical empirical topic-related materials, with presenting the theoretical model and methodological background consisting of 18 research methods. Well, 3 of the instruments were adapted during the research process. The author presents the theoretical model as a foundation for the empirical part of her dissertation, as well as conceptualize all keywords on the dissertation, reflecting a very valuable part of the thesis. It is evidence of the deep theoretical knowledge and very good orientation in the problem discussed in the thesis. Section 2 discusses thematically research results across 6 areas, which addressing a specific problem with separate and comprehensive research tasks. In general, the coverage of the development of the triangulation of methodology is thoughtful and coherent. Used research methods are appropriate to the aims and empirical hypotheses formulated in the thesis. The advantage of such a structure of Section 2 consisting of integral parts can be read and analyzed separately. However, The disadvantage appears in that some proportions of valuable information founded in the chapters are paid only little attention, as measurement techniques and design of different types of studies. The large number of results in different fields of dissertation research are well presented with appropriate statistical analysis, and their interpretation is a high scientific level, demonstrating a solid understanding of the research topic. Nevertheless, concerning the methodological part of the thesis, I would like to make one critical comment. Research procedures are presented without describing following ethic of research. Also, I should like to ask the candidate to answer a question as academical discussion. Question is, what was the author's role and contribution to the joint research projects as a co-researcher? For conclusion, in spite of the above-mentioned minor remarks, this thesis is clearly the result of a great deal of work and much effort that has been devoted to deliver high-quality thesis, bringing new evidence in social psychology in general, with special identification area of economic psychology of time. The present thesis is independently written PhD thesis, which meets the general requirements for this type of academic works. Thank you for presentation and time for the answer for the 2 questions.
Thank you very much for your report, dear candidate.
Important questions, and I will answer in Russian. По первому вопросу,
As for the first questions, I would like to say that at the first stages of the research, we wanted the interaction of psychological time and economic minds without concretizing, and then we found factors allowing us to consider psychological time independent variable of changing economic minds. We, based on Gotsky and Grechov position, that it is fundamental characteristic of human mind, and defining cultural and defines cultural and historical aspects. Historical mind, it is secondary formation, and it is subject to changes in social sphere. In order to check this hypothesis, we used methods of structural equations, which allows to understand connections, cause and effect connections with between 2 phenomena. Index of correlation models. We leave this provision as a main provision of the dissertations. In the future, we will test this hypothesis with the help of experiments or within the frames of longitudinal research. And as for the second remark, the ethical questions should be explained. I was lucky to take part in 4 joint researches when I wrote my dissertation. 3 of them were supported by the Fund of Fundamental Research. The project of psychological time included into the process of globalizations aimed at the process of time perception. I was the supervisor of scientific and organizational parts into other projects on research small people of the south, north, I contributed into the formation of idea of the research, the recycling and interpretation of the research. And here in the hall, there are supervisors of these projects. As for the joint research with Ecuador, I formed the idea for the research, collection of empirical data, and formulation and interpretation of the results. Distinguished Christy, are you satisfied with the answers of the candidates?
Thank you for answer. Thank you.
Уважаемая
Distinguished Agata, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would not read the whole. I would not read the whole review. I would read just the critical points. I consider the research project presented by Ekaterina Zabelina as ambitious, timely, and important. This definitely could be an interesting and important work that might contribute to both economic and social psychology, not only in Russia, but also on international level. However, I have some remarks considering the preparation of the thesis, including the formulation of hypothesis and the theoretical model proposed by the author, research methodology, data analysis, and conclusions drawn from the results. I am presenting detailed comments further in this in the document, but before I turn to my further remarks, I want to stress that I believe that most of these shortcomings can be solved in future work, and my reservation do not prejudge my assessment of the evaluated work. First of all, the literature review in the dissertation was very in-depth and careful, and I would even say that I would expect the literature review in the dissertation to be more condensed, providing just an introduction to own research. Nevertheless, reading this past part was a pleasure, and I especially appreciate that I could learn about the state of research in economic psychology in Russia. However, such a great theoretical review is not summarized with precise hypotheses. The research hypotheses presented on pages 6 and 7 and in the following part of the thesis are more exploratory and general, since they do not include any specific predictions derived from the literature review. Furthermore, the relation between the hypothesis and the theoretical model presented on page 75 is not fully clear, while I would rather prefer to see the hypothesis precisely derived from the theoretical model. In other words, since the title of the thesis is Psychological Time and Economic Mind, Social and Psychological Analysis, I would expect that the main and additional hypothesis would be formulated around the structure of psychological time and economic attitudes and the relation between them, that the author would explain what she means by social analysis and psychological analysis. Now it is more about social and psychological factors and not the methods of analysis. The hypothesis would form the base for or would result from the model proposed by the author, and the hypothesis would allow for specific predictions. The model would be tested using multivariable approach, such as structural equation modeling. Some of these points has been reached, at least to some extent, but the overall picture is not always comprehensive. In other words, the empirical part of the thesis is fragmented, and it is hard to combine the results of the studies conducted by Ekaterina Zabelina in order to conclude whether the theoretical model has been confirmed or not. And this remark is quite similar to the remark made by Professor Koy. It is important to stress out, in my opinion, that it is really impressive how many diverse samples has been included in the studies, from indigenous inhabitants of Russian Arctic to Japan students and citizens of Ecuador. From this point of view, the last part of the thesis, chapter 10, presenting analysis performed on the combined samples, could be a better starting point for their reasoning presented by Mrs. Ekaterina Zabelina. The strong point of this chapter is the application of structural equation modeling for data analysis, since this is the appropriate way of analyzing multiple variables at the same time, accounting for their intercorrelations. However, the model presented in figure 10.6 on page 222 is massively overcomplicated, and it includes an enormous number of unnecessary correlation between measurement errors and latent variables. My guess is that without all these non-hypothesized paths, the model would not fit data well, and in fact, this poor fitted model would be a great starting point for further analysis. Poor model fit in this case would probably result from different structure of the relation between focal latent variables and even different structure of the measurement paths, depending on the specific moderating factors, such as professional status, culture, country of origin, immigration status, etc. In other words, conducting multi-group analysis and invariance testing within this model as a starting point would probably give more comprehensive and comparable results in the specific samples. And I strongly encourage our candidates to reevaluate her data with this approach. My final remark is related to the assumption of the causality hypothesized by the author. Since none of the research designs allowed for testing the causal planes, all of the studies were conducted as cross-sectional surveys and not experiments or longitudinal studies. The direction of paths in the structural model are arbitrary, and they obviously result from the theoretical model proposed by Mrs. Zabelina. However, it is possible that the relation between, for example, the subjective economic well-being and time perspective has the opposite direction. For example, that low versus high level of income hampers the feeling of security, causes threats, and in turn triggers negative perception of other resources, such as time. Alternatively, it might be possible that there is another factor not measured in the studies, such as high versus low neuroticism, high level of anxiety as a trait, or emotional reactivity as a temperamental factor, that is responsible for both negative perception of time and negative perception of one's subjective economic well-being. I would like to ask Mrs. Zabelina to elaborate more on these alternative explanations of her results during the defense. To summarize, my overall evaluation of the presented dissertation is positive, and I reckon that this dissertation meets qualification requirements for the scientific degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences. Thank you very much.
Спасибо большое за вашу...
Thank you very much for your review. Please, dear candidate, answer the question.
Professor Agata Gasirovskaya very much for high evaluation of this study and for important comments. I will answer in Russian too. По поводу первого замечания...
For the first remark, I agree that theoretical analysis of the literature is wider than the hypothesis formulated. There was a task to systemize scientific prerequisites. The hypothesis concerns separate blocks and tasks of the work. And in particular, the subject of economic psychology is investigated. Economic mind, appropriate methods are used to diagnose it. And as for the second remark, we agree that the model is complicated. Fitting the model to achieve higher concordance indices is a common practice in mathematical modeling, according to Nasledov. However, even without additional links between the errors of variables, the model indices were within acceptable limits. I also agree that in subsequent studies it would be interesting to test a simplified version of the model on separate groups of respondents with different professional status, age and gender. Let me clarify that the model was tested on representatives of the Russian sample, therefore perhaps testing it in other cultures will make it possible to concretize individual relationships. As for the third remark, we believe that the level of anxiety or peculiarities of temper, of course, affect both the perception of time and economic mind. Previous works is evidence of this. Tsukhanov, Sheep, Edwards, Lambert, Zimbardo, Boyd, Zhang, Howell, and others. We did not include these variables in the study, however, the results obtained indirectly confirm this effect. For example, some economic attitudes, the psychology of an employee, distrust of financial institutions, may be the result of financial anxiety. In general, I can assume that the characteristics of temper, as well as demographic factors, largely determined biologically, contribute less to the formation of the relationships between psychological time and economic consciousness. Thank you for the idea, which can be verified in the following studies. As for the inverse influence of the level of income in the long term, this is possible provided that income is measured objectively. In the study, we asked respondents to assess their financial position subjectively, that is, satisfaction with income. So this variable can hardly be considered as independent. In addition, we know that the perception and experience of time is a fundamental characteristic of human mind. And it is very likely that psychological time acts as an independent variable in this case as well. Confirmation of this can be found in the concept of balanced time perspective, which shows its effect on increasing or decreasing the level of subjective well-being. Zaleski, Kirk, Bonneville, and others. However, I agree that for greater persuasiveness, it would be better to present for the results of an longitudinal or experimental study. Are you satisfied, dear Agata, with the answers?
Yes, thank you.
Большое.
Thank you very much. Distinguished colleagues, let me voice my report, remark on the dissertation of Ekaterina Zabelina. Allow me not to repeat main moments which have been voiced by my colleagues. Allow me to turn directly to main remarks. And among the remarks which were formulated, let me focus on main points. And I would like you, dear candidate, to answer them. First of all, there is no chapter, the problem of the research, where the sampling procedure program should be, methodological apparatus should be represented, and the explanation of its use. Unfortunately, there is a lack of attention to the sampling and procedure of the research. I would like you to explain why the author studying the time perspective leave behind the attention the methodology of Philip Zimbabwe time perspective. Why don't you use it in your work? And the question to the candidate: how did you observe psychometric rules, questionnaires, and where can we get acquainted with them? It is limitation. Also, the next moment, it is a question. Please specify. There is understanding of practical value of comparative analysis, the attitude towards time, the comparison of psychological time with the representatives of ethnic national groups in the Russian Federation. I think it's very important, but I can't understand the relevance, the comparison of Russia with Ecuador. There is a great difference in mentality, culture, and economic level, mind, economic, and so on. I understand that there was a project connected with Ecuador, and what is the practical value? And on the website of Hasted, there are results of international cross-cultural research, where you can receive detailed information concerning time factor. And there are misprints and miserrors in the work, technical errors, and you did not correct them. Nevertheless, to conclude, I would like to say that the dissertation of Ekaterina Zabelina on the topic Psychological Time and Economic Mind, Social and Psychological Analysis for the degree of a Doctor of Psychological Science, Specialization 190005, Social Psychology, conforms with the requirements stated by the order. Procedure on awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and our candidate, Ekaterina Zabelina, deserves the degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences, Specialization 190005, Social Psychology, points 9 and 11 were not violated by the candidate. Thank you for the attention. Thank you, Svetlana Zakhotovna, for your remarks. The first remark, indeed, in the analysis of the literature on the problem of psychological time and economic psychology, foreign studies dominate, since, as it seemed to us, they are represented by a large number and variety, with the possible exception of organizational psychology. Nevertheless, the review also represents the work of Russian psychologists over the past 5 years. I agree that the few representatives of St. Petersburg Psychological School, among them, in the part of the dissertation research related to cross-cultural approach, the analysis of these works would strengthen the validity of conclusion. And as for authors' methodologies, a more detailed description of the techniques and samples is presented in articles with appropriate references in the bibliography. The methods of Zimbardo, adopted by Sirtsova and Mitina, was one of the main in the study, and since it is widely known in scientific circles, we considered it unnecessary to give its detailed description in the text of the work. As for the author's methods, the detailed description is in the appendix, and the procedure for the development, validation, and adaptation is described in detail in articles with appropriate references in bibliography. As for the third remark, it should be said that one of the hypotheses in this work was the assumption that the cultural characteristics of countries and individual ethnic groups determine the relationship between psychological time and economic consciousness. Testing this hypothesis involves turning to a cross-cultural approach in psychology, which raises questions about psychological truths studied by comparing representatives of different cultural groups. Comparison of different countries within the framework of our study has scientific value in identifying the unique features of psychological time due to the specifics of the world perceptions formed by culture and fixed in the language. When comparing Russia and Ecuador, we used the following methods of identifying equivalence: forward and backward translation of questionnaire statements, exploratory and confirmatory factor analysis, reliability analysis, Satora-Bentley scale, invariance test. The choice of Ecuador as a country for comparison was primarily due to the fact that we have scientific ties in Quito. However, it seems to us that this comparison also carries scientific value, since it provides unique material comparison of the perception of time in European countries. The United States and Russia has already been carried out earlier, but comparison with Latin American countries are much less common. Despite the difference between countries in mentality, history, culture, level of economic consciousness and economy, similar interrelationships of time focus, cultural values, tolerance to uncertainty, long-term time perspective, and subjective happiness were revealed, which indicates the existence of some universal mechanism in this problem. And as for the last point, I believe that typos in a doctoral dissertation are unacceptable. Sorry for that. Thank you very much. I'm satisfied with your answers. Dear board members, dear colleagues, non-board members, are there any volunteers to have the floor? No volunteers. And now the questions which came during our meeting concerning the text of the work placed at the website of the university. Please tell me, are there any questions? No questions. And now let us turn to the speech of our scientific advisor, distinguished Olga Sergeyevna. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for the floor given to me. I would like to say good words. Our candidate is very experienced. She is very hardworking. She has got creative potential. She's a very modest person. It is a rare mixture of qualities. And she is very brave. She took the work on the topic connected with risk, because this topic was chosen after Naistik's dissertation, brilliant dissertation. She considers time there. It is social psychology. And Catherine found the gap, and she filled the lack concerning with the reflection of social psychology, time understanding, depending on different factors of economic activity. In order to consider such a topic, a person should be intelligent, use interdisciplinary approach, culturological, economic, sociological works, and it demonstrates such an intelligence. And the author started with theoretical model. It is the reduction. And that's why, without doubt, there was a risk. But it is, we always want and hardworking character of the candidate is improved by rich empirical material, large number of respondents. I hope that her developments rich material connected with psychological well-being, and with pandemic, how we survived this pandemic. There were many interesting moments, and there was a great contribution. And the last but not least, our candidate has abilities, such abilities, the knowledge of statistics, structural equations, and Catherine can do it, and she has got a good command of the English language, brilliant communicative abilities. It allowed her not only to take part in international conferences, but also to organize such conferences. They were successful, and I took part in some of these conferences, and I hope that in the future she will successfully manage the projects, and I wish her every success in scientific and creative sphere. Olga Sergeyevna, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, are there any volunteers among board members to have the floor? Among those who are present at the meeting, are there questions by emails? No questions. And we finish the discussion and the acceptance of the questions. Before we conclude, and concluding voting, dear board members and candidates, do you have any questions or remarks concerning the procedure of the meeting, including a remote interactive mode? Lyudmila Georgievna, no objection, no remarks. Alexander Alexandrovich, no questions. Timofey Alexandrovich. Christy Koev, any objections? Thank you. Agata Dorota. Dear candidate. Thank you. And now we turn to the next point of our agenda, voting. And now, what time is it? According to Moscow time, it is 4:42 p.m. according to Moscow time. Dear colleagues, now we have got the opportunity before voting to have a discussion in order to discuss the results of the defense, and the broadcast, the sound of the broadcast will be muted. Do we need such a discussion? No, we don't need such a discussion. Thank you very much. If you don't need the discussion of the defense results, we continue our meeting and turn to the voting. I remind you that the opinion of each board member is voiced in public. Please check the sound. Can you hear and see each other? Is the connection is good? And now the crucial moment of our meeting. I raise the question of awarding to Ekaterina Zabelina the doctoral degree in psychology, scientific speciality 190005, social psychology, on open roll call. I remind you that the decision is considered positive as if more than half of boards voiced for that, but not less than 3 people. Distinguished board members, Pachebat Lyudmila, your opinion. The work, great work has been conducted, and I agree with giving Zabelina the degree of Doctor of Psychological Sciences. Dear Maximenko Alexander Alexandrovich, your opinion. Thank you for the floor given to me. I support my opinion, and I am sure that the dissertation of Ekaterina Zabelina conforms with the requirements for doctoral degree, specialization 1905, social psychology. Distinguished board member Timofey Nestik, your opinion. Of course, the work of Ekaterina Zabelina deserves the degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences. Thank you. Agata Dorota, your opinion.
My opinion is definitely positive, and I'm in favor of awarding doctoral degree to Ekaterina Zabelina.
Спасибо. Уважаемый член диссертационного...
Distinguished board member Christy Koev, your opinion.
Thank you. I support giving the Ekaterina Zabelina the doctoral degree.
Спасибо. Я председатель совета Гурьева Светлана Захотовна.
And me, chairperson Gureva Svetlana Zakhotovna, I support this work, and I am sure that our candidate deserves the degree of the Doctor of Psychological Sciences. And now we are going to count the voices. Distinguished colleagues, dear guests, and all those who are present, I announce that out of 6 board members who took part in voting, 6 voted for. There are no one who voted against, and there is no one who abstained from vote. This is unanimous decision. The decision on awarding Ekaterina Zabelina scientific degree of Doctor of Psychological Sciences, specialization 1905, social psychology, was accepted unanimously. Distinguished colleagues, in connection with the fact that our meeting is conducted with the participation of board members in the remote interactive mode, do you have any questions concerning the procedure of conducting the meeting? No questions. And concluding words of our candidate. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to express my gratitude to all board members, to the chairperson, to the remarks which I will take into account, and they are very valuable for my further research. And I would like to thank my scientific advisor. I would like to thank my colleagues, scientific partners who supported me on my way, and without them I could not defend my dissertation. I would like to express my gratitude to the management of Chelyabinsk University, the Dean of St. Petersburg University, employees of dissertation departments for their professionalism. Thank you very much. We congratulate you on the brilliant defense, dear colleagues, dear board members, and all those who are present. I announce the meeting closed, and please switch off the live broadcast of the meeting.